The Amanda Project by Melissa Kantor and Amanda Valentino. Chapter 24. Hand shaking, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded up piece of paper, and when I spread it out, half a dozen pressed leaves and flower petals fell out on the bed. On the paper was a collage of drawings of paints and pieces of plants intertwining and forming a border around a quote written in large, beautifully calligraphed letters, which read, "All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." Underneath, in Amanda's bold script, it said, "The quote is from Edmund Burke, but the drawings are all Beatrix Potter's. Like Beatrix, Bellatrix, we warriors fall, but so too do we rise." And for the first time since Vice Principal Thornhill had called me into his office, I felt really, truly afraid. My heart pounded in my chest, and my brain could only form one thought over and over again. How does she know? How does she know? How does she know? It was raining so hard that night, December 21, the longest night of the year. Icy rain coated the apple tree branches in the yard, until they knocked against the windows of my room as if they wanted to come in. I used to love cold, rainy December nights. My dad would light a fire in the living room and make mulled cider, and we'd all sit downstairs and wait for the power to go off. If you live in the country, you get used to power failures during winter storms. When it did, we'd light candles or read or watch a DVD on my mom's laptop until it got late, and then go upstairs with our candles like we were characters out of a little house on the prairie. But for the past 2 months, my house had been creepy enough without the lights being off. And sitting in my room with a candle and trying to read only made me think of what life was going to be like if my dad really did get fired. He still had a job back then, but he was missing work a lot, and sometimes I heard him having shouting matches on the phone with his boss when I came home from school. So when I heard someone pounding at the front door, my first thought was, and I know this is completely insane, but if you'd been there and felt the creepiness of the night, you might have thought this too, that I'd heard a ghost. But then the person must have realized the door was unlocked, and less than a minute later I heard someone calling, "Callie! Callie! Callie!" and crying. I took my candle and ran downstairs thinking, "Mom!" And instead there was Heidi, soaking wet and sobbing, and she threw her arms around me and just kept saying my name. I'd never seen Heidi hysterical like that. Even when she cut her finger really bad on an X-Acto blade in art class, she just walked calmly over to Mrs. Rose, holding her left hand, which was literally gushing blood, and asked if she could please go to the nurse. So the combination of her sobbing and seeming to barely realize where she was made me think someone must have died. And I just hugged her and rocked her back and forth like my mother did with me, and said that everything was going to be okay, even though I didn't know what everything was yet. Finally, she pulled away from me and walked toward the dark living room. Still crying, she said, "Oh my God, Callie, you have to help me." She had a tissue in her hand, and she ripped it as she walked. "What happened?" I asked, my arms cold and wet from the icy water on Heidi's coat. She perched on the edge of the couch, but instead of answering me, she looked around. I followed her eyes, and even though it wasn't like I hadn't seen my living room, it was different to see it through Heidi's appraising eyes. There were no lights on because of the power failure, but my dad had left candles burning on the dining room table. Their light plus the light from the candle I brought down illuminated the room just enough for anyone to see that something was pretty messed up in my house. Not long after my mom left, my dad had gotten drunk and fired the woman who cleaned our house and sometimes cooked for us when he and my mom had to work late. Since she'd been gone, no one had cleaned or even really aired out the place, so it was sort of this musty smell to it. More recently, my dad had stopped opening or even sorting the mail, so the coffee table next to the sofa was piled high with bills and magazines and letters about frequent flyer miles and free credit card offers and catalogs. I'd been trying to keep up with the dishes, but there were at least 2 wine glasses on the floor and another one on the dining room table, along with an empty bottle of wine. And even though the worst of the foliage didn't make its way across our threshold until much later, there was already some oddly shaped tree branches leaning up against the walls and a bunch of wooden planks stacked up by the dark fireplace. "Heidi, what happened?" I asked again, though this time it was as much because I didn't want her looking around my house as because I wanted to know. Finally, dry-eyed, Heidi spoke without turning to face me. "There was an accident." I thought of Heidi's mom and dad, her little brother. Could one of them be... "Oh my God, Heidi, is everyone okay?" "I don't know," she said, and now she did turn to me. "I didn't stop to check." "Wait, what?" I'd assumed she'd been in a car accident, but of course Heidi didn't drive, so she wouldn't have been the one to stop and check anything. Could something have happened in our house? But in that case, why wouldn't Heidi have called instead of coming all the way over? I'm sorry, Heidi. I'm so confused. What kind of accident? Her gaze level, Heidi said, I took my dad's car out and went for a drive. You took his car? My voice was a shriek. I pictured Heidi behind the wheel of her dad's BMW two-seater. Don't be such a goody-goody, Callie. It's not like I've never driven before. I'll have my permit next year anyway. I'm a good driver, okay? Heidi's eyes flashed with anger, and I sank back against the couch. Sure, I said quickly. I'm sure you are. It wasn't my fault. It was really dark, and the road must have been icy from the storm. The car kind of skidded, and I tried to pull the wheel the other way, and then that's when it happened. Heidi started to sob again, and now that she was crying, not giving me that scary, angry look, I felt bad for her. How many times had my mom or dad barely managed to swerve to avoid a dog or even a deer? How many dead animals had we passed lying in the road? I always wondered what that awful moment would feel like. That instant when you heard the bump and felt the thump of a tiny furry creature under the tires of your car. My eyes prickled. Poor Heidi. Oh, Heidi, I'm so sorry, I said, guilty that I'd been so obviously shocked by her taking the car. Heidi was my friend. She needed my understanding, not my judgment. I slid closer to her and put my arm around her, resting my chin on her shoulder. I'm really, really sorry. You must have been totally freaked. Heidi was still crying hard enough that I wasn't even sure she'd heard what I said. I was about to repeat myself when I realized that between sobs she was trying to get words out. Heidi hiccuped. What? I squeezed her shoulder, then patted her back. I think she saw the car, said Heidi, and saying it made her practically wail in horror. I think she recognized the car. But how could... Suddenly, the end of my sentence died in my mouth, because fuzzy animals don't recognize the cars that hit them. Heidi, what did you hit? My voice was calm and slow. I drew my arm back to my side, shivering slightly from the cold water seeping through my sweater. Maybe because she heard the change in my voice, Heidi sat up straighter. I hit Beatrice Rossiter. She was riding on her bike, probably coming home from one of those geek clubs she belongs to, and I hit her, and I think she might have seen. This wasn't happening. Heidi wasn't really telling me that she'd hit somebody and kept driving. People really didn't do things like that. Did they? Heidi, we have to call someone. We have to call 911, and you'll tell them where to find her. We don't even have to give our names. I couldn't believe how calm and practical I was being. Heidi stood up. Are you crazy? Are you completely insane? You think they won't trace a call like that? I could go to jail, Callie. Is that what you want? You want me to spend the rest of my life in jail just because... The ice that had formed around me cracked, and I was screaming right back at her. They're gonna find out anyway, Heidi. They don't need phone calls to trace stuff like that. They can check dents and paint marks. Now it was Heidi that seemed icy. The car's fine. I checked. It's back in the garage. You can't tell at all. Nobody is going to trace anything. But what if Bee's... I couldn't finish the sentence, but Heidi could. She's not, okay? How do you... She's not. She's just not. Just drop it. I'm sure she's fine. She probably just got a bump on her head and rode home and put an ice pack on it or something. And I'm not going to get my permit or license or worse because some stupid pointless accident. Heidi snarled and she said the last part of the sentence, and the look on her face scared me. I stood up when she did, and now I took a step back. Why did you come here? I need you to cover for me, Callie. If anyone asks, I need you to say I was here all afternoon and night. I thought about how much closer Tracy and Kelly lived to Heidi. How easily she could have gone to one of their houses and asked them for cover for her. She had walked or biked over 3 miles to get from her house to mine. Why? I couldn't not ask. Why me, Heidi? Even in the dim light, even though I could just barely make out her face, I knew. She'd figured it out. She'd figured out something weird was going on with my family. That my mom wasn't always just too busy to pick me up from her house. That there was a reason we never came over to my house anymore. A reason the lawn looked the way it did the few times she and her mom had come to pick me up or drop me off. She never once mentioned anything to me, never once asked me if something was up, if I was okay. But she'd filed away the information, and now that she needed it, she was using it. Because how could she have burst into Tracy or Kelly's house hysterical, dripping wet, and gone unnoticed by their parents? Neither of us said anything. Heidi glanced around the room one last time before looking at me. "We're best friends, Callie," she said. "That's what best friends do. They help each other." She walked across the room, put her arms around me, and squeezed. "Thanks, Callie. You're the greatest." And then she was gone. Without realizing what I was doing, I shredded the collage, and now I dropped it in the trash can, as if Beatrix Potter's drawings were burning my fingers. How could Amanda possibly have figured out that Heidi was the one whose car hit Beatrice Rossiter? Nobody knew but me and Heidi, and sometimes the way Heidi talked about Bea made me wonder if even she remembered what she'd done. I looked back at the quote. All it takes for evil to triumph. What Heidi had done was evil. It was. But what had I done was evil too. If Amanda was looking for a good reason in this scenario, if she was looking for a good person, she'd have to look beyond me. I was in way too deep to be good. And why was Amanda talking about Bellatrix? The only Bellatrix I knew had to do with Beatrice Rosser or Beatrix Potter. It was the third brightest star in the constellation Orion, and its name meant female warrior. Suddenly, I thought of something. Heart pounding, I got up and raced over to my desk, digging frantically through the messy top drawer for my planisphere. Could it be? Was it possible? I spun the outer wheel until I got to today's date, but there was nothing about Orion or Bellatrix. "What are you trying to tell me?" I shouted to the empty room. This was so frustrating. I went back to my bed, spinning the planisphere forward and back, looking at the stars as they rose and fell. All the stars that weren't Bellatrix appearing and disappearing, rising and falling. The third time I pushed the circle forward, I went a bit too far, landing on tomorrow night, not tonight. Tomorrow night, when, between 11 and 12 o'clock, Bellatrix was going to vanish below the western horizon. And I knew exactly where I was going to find Amanda.